Egyptian scribes training under Thoth learned to read 8 signs the body gives at the exact edge of sleep. An order that almost never changes, and almost nobody alive today stays present long enough to catch even the first one before it's gone. There's a passage most of us cross several times a month without ever recognizing it as a passage, a guarded threshold, never a metaphor, never automatic, never free. Guardians at every gate, demanding the soul speak a secret name before the passage would open. In 2001, a Dutch cardiologist published research in the Lancet on patients who came back from cardiac arrest.
Some of them remembered something conscious.
Structured at the exact moment it shouldn't have been possible at all. The gate is rare, not because it happens once in a lifetime. It's rare because almost no one stays conscious long enough at that exact edge to see it.
The moment the sensation starts, the mind reaches for a label fast enough to end the discomfort of not having one yet.
The pressure, the vibration, the doubling, they were still developing when I moved.
I closed it.
The gate you keep asking to see may be the one you keep closing yourself.
Every single time.
Before it ever becomes visible.
Egyptian scribes training under Thoth learned to read 8 signs the body gives at the exact edge of sleep, in an order that almost never changes, and almost nobody alive today stays present long enough to catch even the first one before it's gone. There's a passage most of us cross several times a month without ever recognizing it as a passage, the kind ancient initiation traditions mapped as a real guarded threshold, never a metaphor, never automatic, never free. If you've ever written that pressure off as tiredness, or your mind playing games in the dark, wait until you see the sequence it's actually part of and what changes the instant someone stops interrupting it early. What is that sensation doing before it vanishes? Why does almost no one stay conscious long enough to find out? Close your eyes for 5 seconds right now and try to remember the last time you felt something like that. Don't judge it. Don't name it yet, just find it. To understand what you just found, we have to go back to the oldest surviving text that still carries Thoth's own voice. The oldest surviving text that puts Thoth's own voice on the page is Demotic Egyptian papyrus fragments now scattered across museum collections in Berlin, Copenhagen, Florence, Paris, and Vienna, more than 40 pieces in total, published together by Richard Jasnow and Carl Theodor Zauzich as the Ancient Egyptian Book of Thoth. In those fragments, Thoth is called Rir, literally great, great, great. That's the exact demotic root behind what Greek and Roman writers would later call him Trismegistus, thrice great. In those same papyri, he's shown training a disciple, not in spells, not in magic tricks, in how to approach hidden knowledge, preserve what had been perceived, and interpret realities that ordinary awareness could not easily read. That epithet is confirmed directly in the text itself, not folklore, not a later Greek label layered on top of an unrelated figure, which places these papyri inside the same Egyptian religious and intellectual environment the later figure of Hermes Trismegistus would emerge from. Not a myth borrowed for flavor, a real, traceable thread in the Egyptian scribe's own words. That training had a geography attached to it. Egyptian funerary and cosmological texts mapped a territory called the Duat, not simply the land of the dead, as it's often translated, but a landscape of gates, guardians, and thresholds where a soul had to know something true about itself before a passage would open. Erik Hornung, whose work on these texts remains a standard reference, describes it as a world of transformation, of forms and states of awareness constantly changing into other forms and states. Those gates weren't decorative either. Egyptian sources describe guardians at each one, demanding that the soul speak a secret name before the passage would allow anything through. knowledge in that system was an optional decoration on top of the experience. It was the entry requirement. I want to be careful about what I'm claiming here, because it's easy to overstate this. I'm not telling you that every strange sensation before sleep is literally the Duat. What I'm telling you is narrower. The reason those ancient maps have kept their spiritual weight for so long is that people keep reporting thresholds that echo the patterns those maps describe. So here's the concept I want you holding for the rest of this video: a threshold. One specific, repeatable passage with its own signs in a fairly consistent order. Egypt gave that passage a geography. Tonight, I'm going to give it a body, your body, most likely if you've ever felt what I described a minute ago. I didn't arrive at this from a papyrus, though. I arrived at it the way most people do, by ignoring it for years and then finally deciding not to. For years, whenever it happened, I moved. I opened my eyes, I shifted my weight, I forced myself back into ordinary waking, every single time, without exception. It wasn't one night, it was a pattern, repeating across many nights of deep meditation, always at the exact edge between waking and sleep, the same signature returning, a localized pressure, usually frontal, sometimes lower, near the chest, and a strange sense of doubling, as if part of me had drifted slightly out of alignment with the rest of me. For years, I thought the sensation was the problem. I know now that I had that completely backwards. Most spiritual content handles a sensation like this in one of two ways. Either it dismisses the whole thing, sleep, anxiety, nothing to see here, go back to bed, or it names it immediately, awakening, kundalini, astral projection, day one, no further questions. Both reactions close the investigation before it has a chance to open. Naming something too early is just dismissal wearing a more exciting word. The Thothian response is slower and honestly less satisfying to say out loud. Observe first, record what you actually noticed, compare it against other nights. Only after all of that, interpret. That's not a lack of confidence, it's a discipline, the exact one this video teaches, one sign at a time instead of a label on minute one. There's a line in the Corpus Hermeticum, written in Greco-Roman Egypt, roughly 18 centuries ago, that says ignorance isn't simply a lack of information, it's called the greater evil because it keeps the soul from finding its way back. The instruction the text gives is to open the eyes of the heart. Most people read that line as a poetic way of saying, be intuitive. I don't read it that way anymore. For me, the eyes of the heart points to a perceptual capacity that feels both bodily and energetic at once. I sometimes wonder whether many of us learn to suppress that capacity early in life, not because it isn't real, but because experiences without an accepted name get dismissed before we're old enough to defend them. That's not a metaphor I've chosen because I like it. It's the interpretation I've built my own practice around, and it's exactly the gesture of brushing off a real sensation that this whole video is arguing against. Before I go any further, if any part of what I've described so far matches something you've felt and never had language for, hold that thought instead of scrolling past it. You're going to need it in about 10 minutes. Here's where the case gets harder to wave off. The Book of Thoth gives us a disciple trained to perceive across boundaries most people never test. The Duat gives us a geography of gates that only open under specific inner conditions, never automatically, never for free. Neither of those is a modern claim invented for a video. They're translated, cataloged, and argued over by Egyptologists for more than a century. Then there's a study that has nothing to do with Egypt at all. In 2001, Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel published prospective research in the Lancet on patients who had been resuscitated after cardiac arrest. Some of them later reported structured experiences associated with the period surrounding the arrest itself, when circulation and normal brain function had been severely disrupted. He later expanded the argument in Consciousness Beyond Life, proposing a model of consciousness that isn't entirely dependent on cortical activity. Van Lommel doesn't prove astral projection, he doesn't prove Thothian gates. What his research does is keep alive questions that strictly brain-based explanations still debate. How do we account for organized conscious experience reported around moments when the standard explanation says it shouldn't be possible at all? Similar research out of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies has tracked comparable reports for years. In van Lommel's own study specifically, a minority of survivors reported a near-death experience of this kind. That's not a fringe curiosity. That's a recurring, documented minority inside mainstream cardiology and resuscitation medicine, not inside a spiritual bookstore. I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of claim that gets stretched too far, too easily. I'm not saying an Egyptian initiation text and a Dutch cardiology study prove the same thing. What I'm pointing at is narrower, two unconnected fields, ancient religious training and modern resuscitation medicine, keep circling the same edge. The edge where ordinary consciousness stops being a safe assumption. The gate is rare, not because it appears only once in a lifetime. It's rare because almost no one remains conscious long enough at that exact edge to recognize it while it's still happening. So why does almost nobody stay at that edge long enough to actually look at it? Because the moment the sensation starts, the rational mind does something very specific, not analysis, more like a reflex. It reaches for a label fast enough to end the discomfort of not having one yet. Anxiety, tiredness, imagination, anything with a name is easier to live with than something real and unclassified. Plotinus, writing a few centuries after the Corpus Hermeticum, described the soul's return to its source as an ascent back through layers it had descended through in the first place. I'm not building a doctrine out of one philosopher's line. I'm noting that the shape keeps recurring across very different traditions, consciousness described as something layered, something that has to be re-entered on purpose, not stumbled into by accident. Which means the sensation most of us dismiss in under 2 seconds might be one of those layers making brief, involuntary contact right before habit reaches over and shuts the door again. Think about how fast that reflex moves. You don't decide to call the sensation just tiredness. The label arrives before you've even finished feeling the thing it's labeling. That speed is the tell. Real analysis takes a moment. A reflex doesn't. Here's the shift I actually want you to make right now before we go any further. Stop thinking of yourself as someone who occasionally has a weird sensation before sleep. Start thinking of yourself as someone who has been standing repeatedly at the edge of one specific, nameable passage and closing it yourself every single time out of habit, not out of necessity. My thesis isn't that every strange sensation before sleep is a supernatural portal. That would be a much bigger claim than I can defend, and it's not the one I'm making. My thesis is narrower, and I think more useful. There's a specific threshold in which bodily perception, energy, space, and lucidity begin to reorganize together, and most people end it before they ever discover what it was becoming. That's not a smaller claim than awakening. It's a more honest one, and it's the one this video can back up sign by sign. Let's get specific about what this actually feels like, because vague language is exactly what let me dismiss it for years without noticing. Mark Stavish, In Between the Gates, Lucid Dreaming, Astral Projection, and the Body of Light in Western Esotericism, documents physical and perceptual signs that mark the threshold between ordinary awareness and lucid dream or projection states. A passage he treats as something that has to be prepared for, not simply waited out. Robert Monroe, writing decades earlier in Journeys Out of the Body, calls a related edge a vibrational state. I read him as describing something closely related: vibration, a sense of separation, altered perception, an early flash of fear, and, often, an involuntary interruption that ends the whole sequence. Let me be clear about what these two sources support and what they don't. I'm not saying Stavish and Monroe are describing the same event as the Egyptian sources. What I'm saying is that modern accounts give sensory, physiological language to a passage ancient sources gave sacred, initiatory language to. Two vocabularies, centuries apart, pointed at the same edge of human experience. There's an older Hermetic version of this too. In the Poimandres, the first text of the Corpus Hermeticum, the soul ascends back through 7 planetary spheres, shedding something at each one before it continues upward. Nearly 1800 years before Stavish or Monroe published a single page, that text was already describing extracorporeal passage as a structured, layered event, never a single leap, always a sequence. That clarifies the phenomenon. It doesn't close the mystery. It opens a larger one underneath it. Because if a passage this specific keeps getting mapped independently by traditions separated by centuries and oceans, the honest question isn't which one is right. It's what is the human nervous system doing at this particular edge that keeps producing the same report. Here's what I can actually tell you happened in my own body. On the one night, this went further than it ever had before. The phenomenon, a localized pressure, then a distinct sense of doubling, part of me slightly out of alignment with the rest of me, like a photograph taken half a second too early. The energetic reading, a tightening first, centered near where the pressure had started. Resistance, a flicker of am I making this up? Then an unmistakable loosening outward the moment I stopped reacting to the sensation and simply stayed with it. The thought that ended the state didn't feel like it grew out of my own thinking. It felt like it arrived already finished. What if this is real? That doesn't mean it came from somewhere else. It means its arrival felt abrupt enough to break the state, and that abruptness, not the sensation itself, is what collapsed everything. Before I interpreted any of it, I looked at a few possibilities in order. The sensation did not feel emotionally driven. There was no anxiety behind it, more curiosity than fear. It did not resemble a sudden insight. There was no prior knowledge being synthesized quickly, nothing being figured out. External influence was harder to rule out completely, since these thresholds can sometimes carry the imprint of whatever field surrounds you. But I found no specific perception, communication, image, or environmental change that justified attributing the experience to a presence outside myself, at least not that night. What remained was the experience itself, not a clairvoyant image, not a message, just a direct, unusual alteration in how I perceived my body and the space around it, the kind most people never sit still long enough to register. And there's a question underneath all of this that I'm not going to answer for you tonight because I haven't fully answered it for myself. When a name, an image, a ritual, and a field of human attention survive for 3,000 years, what does a practitioner actually make contact with? Maybe an independent intelligence, existing whether anyone remembers the name or not. Maybe a collective spiritual form, kept alive by belief, writing, and devotion across centuries, the same frame Stavish uses when he describes egregores as coherent forms sustained by ritual and shared attention, something built by millions of minds rather than born from a single one. Or maybe a structure already present inside consciousness, one that the name simply gives us a door to reach, no different in kind from a symbol that unlocks a memory you didn't know you'd kept. I don't know which of those three is true of Thoth. I'm honestly not sure it has to be only one, but I noticed that the question itself doesn't feel abstract the way it did before tonight. It feels like something standing next to the sensation I just described to you, not explaining it, just present beside it. Strip away the papyrus, the cardiology study, the 7 spheres, the whole architecture of evidence. Here's what it actually came down to. On the one night, it mattered. The pressure started the way it always did. The vibration followed a few seconds later. My awareness of the room changed. Sound felt distant, then unnaturally close, in a way that didn't match the actual room around me. And for the first time in years, instead of moving, I stayed still. Not because I'd suddenly found courage, because I decided just once to find out what would happen if I didn't interrupt it the way I always had before. The moment I understood this gate had nothing to do with leaving my body, I didn't leave it. That's not what happened, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a better story. What happened is that I realized the sensation hadn't failed on its own. The pressure, the vibration, the doubling, they were all still developing when I moved. They didn't fade out by themselves. I ended them. The gate did not close on me, I closed it. And here's the part you can test the very next time this happens to you without needing a single ritual or any special preparation. It isn't ancient ceremony, and it isn't waiting for some rare cosmic alignment to line up in your favor. In my experience, the first operational difference was staying still for one breath longer than habit wanted me to. That single choice was enough to separate someone who simply has this sensation from someone who gets to find out what it's becoming. I built a method around that single choice. I'm going to give you all 9 steps right now. You can test them on your own without treating them as a guarantee of projection or contact. This isn't an ancient Egyptian ritual. It's my own method, inspired by the Thothian principle of observing before naming, but built by me specifically for this sensation. No papyrus lists these 9 steps. I'm not claiming one does. The first step, don't move immediately unless there's real pain or genuine distress. The second, notice exactly where the sensation started. The third, notice whether it pulses, moves, or expands. The fourth, pay attention to any changes in sound, space, weight, or body position. The fifth, don't conclude yet that it's sleep, anxiety, energy, an entity, or projection. Naming comes later, not now. The sixth, keep observing until the sensation changes on its own or fades. The seventh, write everything down afterward while it's still fresh. The eighth, compare it against every other time this has happened. And the ninth, look for the sequence across those nights, not just the isolated symptom from any single night. Thoth doesn't open this gate by handing you a key. He opens it by teaching you how not to destroy the evidence of the passage. That's why I call it the rarest gate Thoth ever opened. And I want to be upfront about exactly what I mean by that, because it matters. I'm not quoting a line from a papyrus when I say it. I'm naming, as my own interpretation, the hardest interval in the entire process, the moment perception starts separating from habit but hasn't yet become a vision, a dream, or a complete experience of leaving the body. It's rare not because it happens once in 1,000 years. It's rare because almost nobody stays conscious long enough past that first flicker of fear to recognize it while it's still happening. The gate is rare because the sensation is common. Sustained lucidity is not. Thoth's gift was never the sensation itself. The sensation may be more common than sustained recognition of it ever is. His gift is the capacity to stay lucid enough to read what the sensation is becoming, and the discipline to record it before the mind rushes in to explain it away. You do not lose the possibility forever the next time this happens to you. You only lose the opening that was already forming in that exact instant, the moment you moved instead of staying, because the gate you keep asking to see may be the one you keep closing yourself every single time before it ever becomes visible. If you felt this before and never had a word for it until tonight, do one thing before you go. Type threshold in the comments. Not a story, not an explanation, just the word. I read every one of them. And if enough of you recognize this, I'll go deeper into the full threshold record, every step in a lot more detail in a future video. One more thing I haven't answered tonight because I don't think I'm meant to answer it alone. The question of what Thoth actually is doesn't close once this video ends. An independent intelligence, a collective form built by 3,000 years of devotion, or a structure already inside you that the name simply unlocks. I've sat with it longer than I've let on tonight. And there's a specific reason the ancient sources describe Thoth as a measurer, a scribe, a keeper of records, rather than a being who simply hands you access. I think that reason is the next threshold. I'm not ready to open it tonight, but I'm telling you clearly that it's there.